I wanted to do a kind of view from 30,000 feet of where we are. And I think the title of this section is Some Stories Diagnose a System, which is something longtime viewers of DarkHorse will have heard me say before. But I want to give a kind of refresher of what that means before we get to the specific example.
Diagnose the failure of systems, or just
No, they diagnose the system. What is the state of the system?
Diagnose the system.
Right. So the first example of this is the Evergreen story. Evergreen, what happened to us at Evergreen certainly diagnosed the college of which we were a part for 15 years, but it also diagnosed the university system, right? Something happened to us at Evergreen which revealed a pattern that was common across the academy, but it wouldn't be obvious how common it was for a couple of years, right? And so the story was really what happens when professors who have an excellent track record on issues of race, sex, and gender stand in the way of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives because those initiatives would be bad for the college that they're part of, right? And in fact, bad for the people that they were ostensibly designed to help, right? We saw in the Evergreen story exactly what happens, which is that a phony story of racism is generated, and it is used to support riots, to force the hand of the administration. And the administration, of course, uses this as a bit of leverage to remake the college for their own purposes, right? Bloating administration, etc. So the Evergreen story diagnosed the system by showing you, it's like luminol in some sense. Luminol being the substance that is sprayed on a crime scene that then allows UV light to reveal where there might be blood or bodily fluids, right? So some stories function like that. Election fraud.
Some stories function like luminol. That's what you're saying.
They function like luminol. Election fraud is another such story, right? We can see by the way the press has dealt with the question of election fraud in the U.S. that effectively what we have is no longer a press interested in finding the truth. What we have is a press that is interested in the team sport of politics that basically highlights the possibility of election fraud when it works against the team that they're affiliated with and obscures it when it works for the team that they are affiliated with, right? So we can see where once upon a time the idea that there could have been a distortion in an American election would have been a tremendously important story that would have been of interest to anybody who was patriotic and interested in the health of the nation. Now we know that the press has taken sides and they will only look at the story or frankly invent the story in service to one team and not the other.
Yep. And so both of your first two examples, Evergreen as diagnostic of the larger system of higher ed, and coverage of election fraud as diagnostic of journalism writ large, speaks to two systems that are explicitly supposed to be, that in fact do not function if they fail to be nonpartisan. Nonpartisan is the shallow end of the pool. Journalism and higher ed broadly explicitly needs to encourage the investigation of stories such that the truth is discovered. And it feels like you're going to go a third place, which I'm betting is going to be science, which is the biggest one of these. If science doesn't, if what we are calling science has a pre-drawn conclusion, and there's only one thing that you're allowed to conclude, regardless of whether or not research was done or not, regardless of what the data say or don't, then you're not doing science any more than you're doing journalism if you only cover one side, any more than you're actually engaged in an act of higher education if you allow ideologically motivated people to draw attention away from you doing something which is actually antithetical to higher ed, which it is in part, as you said, about bloating administration.
Well, you're close. What you're suggesting is certainly included in what I'm going after here.
Your third example.
My third example diagnoses a much larger system. And in fact, I don't think it's a system that has a name. We can talk about our global system, and that has a kind of a vague limit on it. But I would say we are all embedded in a nested hierarchy of systems, right? And what COVID did was diagnose the entire thing. And I'm afraid that what it has to say is terrifying, frankly.
Okay, so then let me say then, not knowing exactly where you're going with that you can put the third thing in there that's at the same kind of level, that is science.
Oh,
right? You've got higher ed, you've got journalism, and you've got science, and I would not want to be the person to rank the importance of science versus journalism in a functioning society. Higher ed also being necessary, but you're then going to talk about some umbrella thing that doesn't even have a name. It's so big and amorphous. But certainly there are aspects of what happened in the last 2.5 years that reveal that what we call science and many of the people we call scientists are actually no such thing.
Oh yes, I'm absolutely going to suggest that one of the subsystems that is diagnosed by COVID is science, and it is beyond unhealthy at this moment. It's just embedded in a larger network. And, I don't know whether science is more important or less important than journalism in a functioning system. I would say having a functional scientific system and journalistic apparatus are both prerequisites. So the point is, there isn't a more important. You need both those things, in order for your car to function. Is the engine more important than the transmission? No, you need them both to work. So in any case, what I'm going to argue is that among the things that COVID has revealed is that journalism is completely dead, right? The fact is there are stories inside of the COVID story that are just waiting for a journalist to take them seriously, to investigate them without partisan commitments and follow them where they lead. Huge stories that in the world that you and I were born into were not only the kind of thing that would make a journalist's career, but they were the kind of thing that altered history, where journalists revealed something and the powerful were in no position to stop it. And these were the things around which history pivoted. And the fact that we've got these stories and can see them, we can name them, and yet there does not appear to be a journalist who regards themselves as capable of pursuing it, or that they are ready to confront the kind of power that they would have to confront in order to pursue it, is very shocking. So we'll return to that. But journalism is one of the things that is clearly diagnosed by the COVID story, the failure of certain stories to be systematically explored by, not even just a journalist, but some newspaper or journalistic magazine that wished to ascend to the top of that hierarchy, right, could do so simply by pursuing these stories if something else weren't taking priority, taking precedence.
Yes.
The second thing is exactly what you mentioned. It's science. We are, I think, living in a dark age. I think that has been arriving for some time. I strongly encourage members of our audience who have not listened to my conversation with Steve Patterson to do so. He and I discussed the question extensively. He has a different approach to the question of whether we are in a dark age, but nonetheless, I think the idea that we might be and that the evidence is actually persuasive is something that is it's profoundly important because of, is it more important than journalism? Who knows? But is it vitally important that you have a functional truth-seeking apparatus able to figure out what the basic facts imply? Right? Of course it is, especially, the more technological and complex our lives become, the more important it is that we're able to sort signal from noise and figure out what we're doing that is inflicting harm on us and what we might do that would make us healthier and safer. Another system that is clearly diagnosed by this is universities. And it turns out that whatever universities were previously, they have become effectively churches that exist in service of a particular team's articles of faith. That is to say, they rationalize belief in certain things that may or may not be supported by any evidence, right? A team declares that something is true, and then the university provides what appears to be science that suggests that it's true, irrespective of whether or not there is an equally compelling or more compelling body of evidence that suggests that it's false, right? That is not the function of a university as it has been defined, but it is the way that these things are behaving.
Yeah, and you can't claim that a university acting that way isn't a university. I mean, you might, but because university is defined as a much larger and more amorphous thing, that's not the kind of claim that I think you or I would make. But we can and will and have said, actually, when you do it like that, when you have a foregone conclusion and you look for evidence to fit that, or to analyze in such a way, data to analyze in such a way that it can be made to look like it fits, that's not science. It's not science.
Right, it's not science. And it'd be one thing if it was just simply not science. But when it's dressed as science and it's specific, so it's basically sucking up all the oxygen in the room for doing science,
right,
and not doing it, that's lethal.
I've heard my science for the week, done the science.
Oh man,
yep.
I so followed the science.
Yeah.
I followed so much science, I was exhausted. It was like I'd run a mile.
I'm going out for pizza now because I'm scienced up.
It actually suggests something I've said in a very different context. I've argued that the American founders made an error for which we can't hold them responsible because of when in history they existed. They built an evolutionary system. They built a system that had all of the necessary components for it to evolve without building in a structure that recognized that and counteracted it, right? So the point is they built something with the intention to create X, but because it evolved, basically it found a niche and became Y, which is something being pre-Darwinian they could not have properly anticipated. And
they did a hell of a job, though.
Oh, they did. They far exceeded expectations, given what they knew. But given what we now know, the answer is: look, anytime you build something with all of the characteristics necessary to make it evolve, A, you'd be a fool to think it won't, and B, you have to do something to deal with what it's going to evolve into, and the right thing to do is to make sure that it can't find a niche that does things that you don't want done, right? Yeah. So our system has evolved into something without a name, and it masquerades as a democratic republic, and it serves some other function. And the universities are like this too, right? The universities, because of the reward structure in them, have evolved to become this church-like entity with sacred beliefs that cannot be challenged with evidence, right? That thing was inevitable that this would happen, but it results in this other thing that we've talked about extensively, which is the mismatch between the contents of the box and the label on the box.
That's right.
Oh, it says university on it. Oh, this must be a place of truth-seeking. No, yeah, it was at one time, but it has inverted its purpose, right? It's now a truth-obscuring entity.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lab coat is a kind of label. I said last week I think lab coats are cheap. Labels are cheap. It's a lot cheaper to change what you call a thing or what you slap on the outside of a thing than it is to change the actual thing itself.
Right, and it is also, a lab coat is a cloak, and the point is a cloak is an obscuring entity. It obscures something. And so the point is, if you were to invent something that does what modern universities do, we would spot it, we would recognize it as a hazard. It is only because it is dressed in sheep's clothing that we don't notice what role it is taking on.
Well, I mean, I think that can be the case, but I think I disagree with you a bit here. I don't see a lab coat primarily as a cloak or a wolf dressed in sheep's clothing. I think unfortunately, what it is, it is the insignia of I am a scientist, and of course, there's lots of us who do science who don't do lab science, and so have a relatively rare reason to be wearing a lab coat. But I think for me, I used to in the beginning of my Evergreen programs in my what is science lecture say, what do you need to do science? You need glassware, you need a lab coat, you need a PhD, and of course you need none of those things. And this was the point. But the lab coat is this imprimatur. It's the symbol that suggests that what's inside is going to be a real scientist, but actually anyone can put on a lab coat.
Yeah, well, all right. But then metaphorically, this is particularly good, because if you think about what the lab coat is, right, where it came from, science is messy. You don't want to get it on you, right? That's what a lab coat is for, right? You are going to be doing science, and whether that is caustic chemicals or
so you're not talking metaphorically here.
No, I'm talking quite literally. That science is messy. You don't want to get it on you because it could be pathogenic, it could be poisonous, it could be caustic, it could be a lot of things. And so
be gross.
It could just be gross. But the idea that this thing is supposed to protect what is inside, and it has now become its inverse. It now hides what is inside. What is inside is now the dangerous thing. Right, and it is it is very much like the metaphor of sheep's clothing, from the point of view of an unsuspecting public that doesn't really get that what makes something science is this particular adherence to a method and the philosophy that underlies it, and it is not the walks like a scientist, talks like a scientist thing, which is now very misleading.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we could argue this point, and it's going to feel very semantic to a lot of our audience for a long time. I think, for me, the main problem with the lab coat is not that it can obscure, but that it appears the same. That that the institutions of higher ed themselves have become so corrupted that the granting of the PhD that enables you to have the lab, that enables you to have the lab coat, or maybe it's just you're a lab tech in a lab and you're mostly washing glassware, but you still have the lab coat. Many people will view the lab coat as, oh, okay, well then I'm gonna ask that guy, because you're wearing the thing that tells me that you have some kind of authority, and so it's the use of the lab coat as an indicator of authority that I find to be the giant risk. And he's too easy a target at this point, and it's just remarkable to me how politicized this has become. The idea that those who criticize Fauci are inherently on the right is insane. It really makes the left look like a bunch of baboons, frankly, and we're not all of us. But Fauci claimed to be science on more than one occasion, and he ain't. And he wasn't doing it either. He was a political animal the entire time, and maybe he was a political baboon, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm not disagreeing with you. I would point out that the Milgram experiment more or less exactly tested this question, that somebody who was dressed as a scientist carried a kind of authority that would cause people to harm other people.
Yeah.
But I would also point out what we're really, go one layer down from what we're discussing, and there is an underlying truth, which is, to the extent that something carries special authority, it is going to be targeted and captured, and it's going to be worn as a cloak, right? So what is the New York Times? It is the paper of record, except what it is now is some propaganda rag that is owned by we don't exactly know what, and, speaks their sacred truths as if they were actually true. And so, that should not be surprising. The fact that there was a paper of record makes it an irresistible target for capture, and unless it had an incredibly good immunity, of course it was going to be captured. And, likewise, universities, of course they're going to be captured. Likewise, Wikipedia. Oh my God, there's a free encyclopedia that serves nobody's interests because it's non-profit. Yeah. Wow, what a tantalizing thing to capture and get it to speak your particular propaganda, because people take it as impartial. Yeah. Right? So basically the point is, as soon as you establish the thing that we all need, which is the voice that does not pay any heed to people's financial interests or power, once you've got that thing, you've also put a bullseye on it, right? It's going to be targeted for capture, and if you don't protect it, then the point is it's going to become your enemy.